Okay, let's see. Talk a little bit about Darwin. I don't know why. He's a charlatan. There we go. That'll work. Okay. So, oh, by the way, there's, is that right? There's something with Wallace is coming up here soon. I think it's this 150th, I don't know, I forget what it was. But anyway, Wallace, was one of the guys that, along with Darwin. Darwin first, and then, but he didn't write anything until, 15 years later. So, Darwin's two great ideas. First one, descent from a common ancestor, right? So, you can have traits because you inherited them, or you have a species that inherited certain behaviors. Or, of course, you can also evolve new behaviors as well, based on perhaps natural selection. So, descent from a family tree. Oh God, that's right. It's dead. No, it's alive. Okay, good. So, this is not your family tree. No, it's not. It's fading. Okay. This is not your family tree. This is. Okay? Much like a phylogeny. So, why do you resemble each other? Anybody in here who doesn't resemble your parents or your siblings? You all do? Huh, okay. I guess the milkman never got to your family. Huh? Okay. Pretty much you inherit stuff. There we go. Is the resemblance of relatives similar to the resemblance of species? Anybody? So, you're descended from your common ancestor, which is your parents. And what are species descended from? What? You got it. What is it? Yeah. In other words, common ancestor of all vertebrates. It's not really a bony fish, it's another kind of fish. Okay? Common ancestor of all four-legged vertebrates. Right? They're descended from a most recent common ancestor that we share with the four-legged vertebrates. They were probably, amphibious. And we share a lot of those traits. We have four legs. We have similar physiology. All sorts of similarities between them and us. The four legs, of course, homologous bones in the limbs. Same bones, just kind of repurposed for each new environment. So, why might descendants of either resemble their ancestors? Well, they inherit them. I'll do that again. Okay, so why are neither descendants, family, or species identical? Okay, in terms of us, it's because of sexual reproduction. So, there's gene shuffling. We inherit one chromosome, set of chromosomes for our mother, one for our father, with some crossing over. But which ones we get from our mother or our father depend on, it's a 50-50 toss, whether we get their father's mother's genes or father's chromosome, or the other way around? Well, species, why are they not identical? What's the reason for why a species might, or some taxon might be different from its common ancestor? What are the forces of evolution?
Shuffling.
What?
Shuffling of genes. I don't know.
Okay, that's sexual reproduction. What else? There's 4 forces.
Natural selection.
Yeah.
Mutation, fitness, environment.
Non-random mating. Migration.
Are you talking about like Hardy Weinberg, like his?
Yeah, exactly. Genetic drift. Right. Okay, so if we're talking about, in this regard, it could be any of those forces that cause a species to diverge from its common ancestor given enough time. The only way you actually get adaptation, though, is with natural selection. In other words, evolution by natural selection, not natural selection. Natural selection is anything that happens to an organism during its life, whether it's good or bad. But it has to be heritable. So, evolution, any consistent difference in survival and reproduction, in other words, fitness, among phenotypically or genotypically different classes of organisms within a population. So you can have differences that don't affect survival and reproduction, and they won't have any effect. Or they'll have no adaptive effect anyway. And of course, if they do, they have to meet certain criteria for natural selection. Okay. So, in this case, natural selection is the modifying force. But remember, there's 3 or 4 other forces of evolution that are also modifying, but this is the only one that can lead to adaptive evolution. And what's an adaptation? What's an adaptation?
It's an adaptation.
Mm-hmm.
It's like modifying your genes.
Okay, but what makes something an adaptation and something else not?
It's combined with fitness that has some
Fitness.
problem.
Exactly. So, an adaptation is a trait or genes that make an organism increase its fitness in that environment. That's all it is. That's the modifying force. So, you lead to an adaptation because those traits are better fit. Think about it in terms of not behavior, but let's say coat length in wolves. You have this give me this. There we go. Okay, so for this present environment, this is what the distribution of fur length and thickness looks like. We'll say right here is, I don't know, 15 centimeters, something like that. Now, if it was going to get colder, what would happen to this distribution? What would do better in a colder environment? Longer or shorter? Okay. So, in other words,
A shift to the right.
all this, these guys don't leave so many offspring, right? These do. And now we've shifted over from, let's say, here, we've now shifted over where it's 20 centimeters. Okay? Directional selection. That means originally, the original population, only a portion of it was better adapted. Yeah,
What species are we talking about?
wolves.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Anything with fur. How's that? If it gets colder, longer fur, thicker fur. So, now we've gone to 20 centimeters. They're adapted for colder climate. If it was to switch back again and got warmer, we'd go the other direction, right? So, there's that. Go here, get rid of all that. And we'd switch back, oops. We'd switch back to here. Okay, same thing with a trait. More of one thing or less of one thing. So, natural selection, of course, is the only mechanism that generates adaptation. There are all these other forces that don't. They don't, like genetic drift. It could be good, it could be bad, it could be nothing. Let's see. Non-random mating. Same thing. It could be, obviously, you're going to reduce the effective population size if it's non-random mating, like mating like with like. So you'll have stronger genetic drift. Migration brings alleles into and out of a population. Those alleles might be adaptive for that new population, or they may be maladaptive. In other words, those alleles were better in some local environment with another population, wherever it was, came into the population, but for this current environment, it's not. So, is there a difference between natural selection and evolution by natural selection? Anybody? What do you think?
I think so.
Yeah? Okay, what's the difference?
Because evolution can affect on natural selection, but natural selection by itself, like species can choose their.
Kind of. Okay.
I don't know how to explain.
Yeah, so it's natural selection affects, if it's evolution, if it's heritable, and there's variation and all that. Otherwise, you can have natural selection. Well, we'll see. Let's take a look at this. If a lion eats you, is that natural selection?
Yes.
Okay. Anybody disagree with that? No. It's not a very pleasant form of natural selection, but for the lion it is. If you get the girl and I don't, is that selection?
Yes.
Yes, exactly. Story of my life. Okay. So, it's not always on survival. It can be on reproduction as well. Remember, survival is kind of meaningless. It's a means to an end. Do you survive long enough to reproduce? Now, I've survived a very long time, and I haven't reproduced, so survival hasn't done me a damn bit of good. Well, except it has, because I otherwise have to be feeding children, and they'd be asking for stuff and all that, so that's good. But in general, I'm one of the walking dead, right? My genes aren't passing on into future generations. So, remember, the only thing that counts is reproduction, so all of you in here, it's a free-for-all. Start having sex and having as many babies as possible, okay? Because that's the coin of the realm. The more you have, the better, because each one will be an extra shot in your gun for being a success. Not all of them are going to be great, but some of them just might be pretty damn good. Like, for example, we'll go back there for a second. So, in one alternate universe, I do get the girl. I have lots of offspring. Some of those offspring inherit the traits that allow me to get the girl. In other words, I'm attractive to women, right? And they want to have sex with me, and some of those offspring will be carried on forward. Okay, right. So, now, if I bop you on a head and kill you, is that natural selection?
Yes.
That's good. If you get hit by a bus, is that natural selection?
Yes.
Okay. Do you think it's adaptive? Getting hit by a bus. Not currently, but do you think it's getting not hit by a bus? Do you think that's adaptive? Like, some people are more likely to get hit by a bus than others.
Yeah.
Why?
If they don't understand.
Right. They're bad eyesight. They don't pay attention. Okay. So it could be, though, that none of those things operate. So you can get hit by a bus, but it's not evolution by natural selection. It's just natural selection. It could also be that you survive getting hit by a bus because your skin is a little thicker than anybody else around you. And instead of dying, you actually survive, and you reproduce, and your offspring have slightly thicker skin as well. And then there's some of those in that distribution of skin's thickness are thicker still. And then over evolutionary time, you end up with descendants that actually kind of have bony plates of thickened skin, like a rhinoceros, right? And they would probably handle getting hit by a bus much better than normal thickness of skin. So you can have a morphological effect. You can also, like you said, have a behavioral effect. Some people are more aware of what's going on around them than others. Or some people are more afraid than others. They're more aware because they're looking out for whatever is after them. And let's see. Essentially, natural selection kind of basically grinds all of us up. It just that it grinds some of us up a little more quickly than others. You could even take that into a philosophy. It's a rather terrible. Natural selection is not. If there was a creator, natural selection, you can't say that's a merciful way to get things done. You know, it'd be better off if you don't make it, you're gone, you don't feel anything. But natural selection, you're getting ground up. Is there natural selection living in a modern society? Yes? No? Okay. So, what kind of selection is going on in a modern society? Think about how did our ancestors used to live for the most of human history? Did they live in cities, or did they live in what? Small clans? How did they make a living?
Working in the farm.
Okay, that's one thing. What else? Hunter-gathering? Initially.
Hunting.
Right. So, and they lived in what kind of environment? A small environment, where probably you knew everybody in your group. Now, is that a different social environment than what we see today? A lot different. Back then, when a stranger came along, well, I want to hit him on the head. Not because he's bad, but he might be. So, unless, of course, the stranger came bearing gifts or something, and then you'd hit him on the head and take the gifts. But you've still hit him on the head. This idea of the noble savage who, was nice and everything, it didn't exist. There was kind of a constant level of warfare going on all the time. The thing is, when you meet a stranger, are you afraid initially?
Yes.
Some are, yeah? How about some aren't? How about
But where?
somewhere? Okay, exactly, somewhere. I meant to have, oh, that's right, I should have Phil. Well, maybe I'll have him in next time. But anyway, a friend of mine, he's a film director, and he went to South Africa. And South Africa is a dangerous society. If you're driving in your car, you can be stopped, and they'll take your car. They might shoot you in the process. You have to be aware of all the time of what's going on around you. And he said, well, we don't typically live in a society like that, do we? We feel pretty good where we go, like we're not in any imminent danger. But in South Africa, it was quite different. It's kind of like being an animal where there's other animals out there that are hunting you. Same sort of feeling. You have to be kind of hypervigilant. You also might change your body posture. You might say, no eye contact. Or you might come out with, your head held high and you walk down the street like someone's confident, and that might deter someone else from taking things from you because it's just too expensive. So, what are the requirements for evolution by natural selection? It's 4 of them. Anything?
Variation.
Variation. Okay. Oh.
Random mating.
Okay. Random mating is.
Oh no, that's Heidi boy.
Yeah, that's okay. Okay. Now that variation. Tell me about that variation. What else does that relate to? What kind of variation must it be for natural selection to work on? Heritable. Okay, good. So, right here, of course, this is our variation. This is our heritable variation. Okay, and then what's next? Selection on that heritable variation. Okay. Selection on individuals with heritable variation, and that leads to higher fitness in those inherited traits. And here's selection. Who's it going to be? Right? Probably this guy. Always keep your head down. It's better to be a hammer than a nail. So, evolution by natural selection, it gradually transforms a population over time. You can have selection where there's no evolution. Either because there's no variation, so you really can't, there's nothing to work on. That variation isn't heritable. Or the selective force kind of is meaningless. It's kind of immune to being passed on. So like if we were to get hit on the head by a comet, like the end Cretaceous, there's really nothing that would make us less likely to die from the comet. We could be hypervigilant. Oh, there's a comet coming. It still won't do you any good. Okay, so, of course, there's all kinds of variation. This is all morphological variation. Red peppers, different people, different butterflies, different genes, perhaps different behavior, genetic variation. But in terms of animal behavior, there's certainly lots of variation going on. And like I said, some of that variation might be good. So there's something called animal personalities. I don't know if you've heard about that. We have personalities, right? Some of us are comic and some of us are serious. But let's say in terms of shy to bold, it's a continuum, right? Some of us are more shy than others. Some of us are less. Same thing appears to be going on with a lot of animals. Some are more aware of their surroundings than others. They're more vigilant. Others want to be first. Some of those traits in terms of shyness or boldness are heritable. So the offspring wants to be, let's say, the leader of a bunch of sheep. She always leads first. Always. There's a hierarchy. Even though she's perhaps in more danger than everybody else, but she's got a certain place in the hierarchy where she's more dominant. So, different sources of heritable variation. Phenotype, right? The actual expression of those traits in the environment. There's obviously oftentimes a genetic underpinning and an epigenetic underpinning. Anybody know what an epigenome is? If you don't, you can say no, I don't know.
No, I don't know.
Okay. Okay, so back in the old days, it was thought, we all know codons code for amino acids, which code for proteins. And it was thought that genes are either on or off. The idea that genes are often regulated and expressed differently in different environments, people didn't really, well, there was no real mechanism for it. And it was only until more recently that transcription factors that you might have learned about affect upregulate, downregulate, modifications to the DNA, to the histone protein. So, in other words, some areas of the genome are open to expression, others are locked down. So all that is kind of new. And in terms of the genome, instead of being an on-off switch, it's more like a dimmer. You think of dimming or making brighter, that's more gene expression or gene product or less. And that might, let's say those transcriptome factors upstream affect the structural protein downstream, which might be because there might be something that affects behavior. The epigenome is actually heritable. It's been shown that in a population where there's been a famine, not only is the next generation favored to be smaller, they usually are because they've gone through a famine, they don't have enough resources, but their grandchildren and great-grandchildren also are smaller, even if the environment changes. So, this is evolution by natural selection again, variation, inheritance, and differential reproductive success. Brighter beetles are bitter, and predators learn to avoid them. Bright beetles are more likely to survive and more likely to reproduce than the dull-colored beetles. And so, over time, we end up with brighter beetles. So, evolutionary fitness. Is he fit?
Yes.
Yeah. Why?
He looks good.
Okay. Can you be not looking fit and be more fit?
Yeah.
Okay. By the way, he is fit. He's got lots of children from all sorts of different women too, just so you know. I mean, only a few have come out, but there's others. I mean, come on. You know, a hunk like that, they just can't. They beat him off with a stick. Okay. What was that?
Oh, he was asking, that was Arnold.
Oh, yeah, it's Arnold. Arnold. Yeah. How is Arnold Schwarzenegger and a toadfish similar? Anybody?
Their brain size.
They both have lots of small, cheap sperm. Okay, so we know what an adaptation is. Okay, the thing is everything adaptive? No. Has anybody ever read Candide by Voltaire?
Oh, my sister did.
You
I
did
almost
once
Yeah,
upon a
she's
time.
philosophy major.
Yeah. Anybody else? You know who Voltaire was? Okay. This was during the French Enlightenment. In other words, people were pretty pissed off by this time. There had been hundreds of years of religious conflict in Europe. The Catholics had been burning Protestants at the stake, and the Protestants had been, well, let's say eating Catholics, something like that. They were been at each other's throats, and there were all these, of course, strictures about what you can and can't do. And people finally just said, don't tell me what to do. So Voltaire, at that time, have you ever heard the expression, everything is for the best? Do you ever say that sometimes? Something happens and you say, oh, everything's for the best. You know, someone gets hit in a car wreck, oh, everything's for the best. A tsunami comes along, kills 300,000 people or more, everything's for the best. So, Voltaire, in 1755, there was a great earthquake of Lisbon that basically leveled the city. All these people died. You know, and Voltaire, there were other people running around saying everything's for the best. They were trying to make sense of this. And he said there's nothing to make sense of. But Dr. Pangloss was a creation in Candide. He was the tutor for Candide and his sister. And he was fashioned after a guy named Leibniz. Leibniz was the co-inventor of calculus. Leibniz was a very intelligent guy, but he said also that we live in the best of all possible worlds. It can't be otherwise. And Voltaire said, you got to be kidding. So he wrote this little novella, very funny, and it's been turned into plays and movies, sometimes set in modern settings and whatever, ever since. So, if you say, okay, well, how does this relate to natural selection? Well, evolution by natural selection, some people think it is the ultimate optimality machine. So anything can be adapted eventually. You can get a trait from anything that will be adapted to that environment. Are there any other situations where that isn't true? Why don't pigs fly?
They're too fat.
Okay. They don't have wings. Why don't they get wings?
They never needed it.
Well, let's say they do need it now. Let's say they're in an environment and suddenly it'd be really good if they could fly.
If they need it, then eventually they'll have it.
Why?
Natural selection will affect them.
That's right? Except that you're saying natural selection will eventually fix that.
Yeah.
Will natural selection eventually fix that?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily. Think about genetic constraints. Well, there's certain constraints on how bodies adapt. Okay, so we're all quadrupeds, right? Now, one of the lineages of quadrupeds led to individuals that could actually swim in the sea, and they lost their 4 limbs. So, yeah, that's natural selection. It's pretty good. But most other ones, there's constraints on suddenly getting a trait that makes it adaptive in this completely new environment. Natural selection, evolution by natural selection, is not a complete optimality program. Okay, there are constraints on what evolution can accomplish with what it has. It's like the panda principle. Pandas have this opposable thumb, but it's not from this digit that we inherited from our 4-legged ancestors. It's actually a bone in the wrist. So instead of ending up with a thumb like we do, they ended up with a proto-thumb that works almost as good. So in other words, natural selection can only act on the available alternatives, not anything's possible. And those, of course, constraints are, well, one of them is evolutionary history. Another is present conditions. You can inherit a trait that isn't adaptive in this present environment, and that just might lead to extinction. So, can we assume that a trait that increases survival is that adaptive? No. I see no. Anybody yeses? So you live a long time like me, but it doesn't do you any good. How about it increases your reproductive success? Is that adaptive? Maybe, maybe not. Under what circumstances would a survival reproductive success enhancing trait actually be selected against? Can you think of any? Let's make believe that there's this population of animals, and the species generally, they have a clutch, a number of offspring, let's say 4 to 8. And under some circumstances, 4 is better if there's less food, and others is 8. And a mutant comes along, and this mutant can have more. In other words, leave more offspring. The thing is, these organisms eat things in their environment. The environment only produces so much they can eat. So if you had more offspring, could you necessarily raise them to the point where they were successful? No, it might be, so suddenly you've overrun the resource base, and in fact the whole population crashes. So you can think about it, some traits, even if they appear to be adaptive, you actually have to test that. I think I'm done.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Now we can go on to our little discussion. Are you guys ready? Okay. Oh.